Hello everyone, I am the Medic Kirby, and welcome to my channel, The Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews and other deck techs. On this season finale of The Brewery, I'll be discussing my take on a commander from Innistrad Midnight Hunt, Rem Karolus Stalwart Slayer. If you like this deck or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. The best way you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. For just $1, patrons get early access to certain videos on YouTube. In fact, patrons got a chance to see this video earlier. You can also support my channel for free by simply liking, subscribing, and sharing, which also helps out a lot. You can join my Discord server for free if you want to join the Commander Tavern community. All pertinent links are down in the description. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Rem is a 2/3 human knight with flying and haste for 1 generic, 1 red, and 1 white. Thanks to Rem, if a spell would deal damage to you or any other permanent you control, you prevent that damage. Essentially, any damage dealt to you from burn spells is prevented. He doesn't prevent damage from permanents, but for 3 mana, he's still doing a lot. Especially since we're not going to be using this ability defensively, but proactively. But we'll see that in a moment. In fact, that tactic is even boosted further by Rem's second replacement effect. If a spell will deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage plus 1 instead. The moment I saw this legendary creature, I fell in love with it because it's another step in the right direction for red-white legendary creatures, which is making them work independently from the combat phase. So let's see what inspired me to build around Rem. As I just mentioned, we're going to proactively use his replacement effects, and the way we're going to be doing that is by purging our opponents from the table with fire. Since we don't take damage from spells, then what better spells to cast than spells that deal massive amounts of damage to the entire table? Price of Progress, Acidic Soul, and Incite Rebellion are relatively cheap to cast compared to the amount of damage they can deal. Granted, these seem more like finishers since they'll deal more damage the farther along the game has progressed, since the first two depend on the amount of lands and the third with the amount of creatures. But if we have damage increasers and multipliers on the battlefield, then these can deal a ton more damage later on. Keep in mind that Rem also increases the damage of your spells by 1, and he's not the only effect like that in the deck, but we'll see the rest of them later. Hour of Devastation, Blasphemous Act, Chain Reaction, and Star of Extinction are also pretty devastating, at least to the creatures on board. Well, opponent's creatures only, thanks to Rem. The great part about these spells is that you can gauge how much damage they're going to deal with a predetermined amount of mana, so you don't have to sink your mana to potentially wipe the board. And some of these have the potential of dealing a ton of damage to the board, potentially wiping it of creatures. However, with X-costed spells like Fault Line, Magmaquake, Earthquake, and Molten Disaster, you do have to determine what to pay for them. That being said, they're great for when you have a ton of mana for it, for when you can multiply and or increase their damage output. The 4 in particular are great because they do not hit flying creatures, so they don't damage Rem, unlike the previous ones that are able to. That being said, sometimes we do have to hit flyers, so Starstorm and Rolling Earthquake are also included. At least Rem dying when these spells resolve is okay since it happens simultaneously. So our other creatures, as well as ourselves, still have the damage prevented. We'd then have to recast Rem if we need to cast another one of these spells again. However, the deck does have more ways of protecting ourselves and our creatures from damage, so it shouldn't be so bad. In any case, decks should always try and have redundancy with their commander if there are cards that have similar effects. At least Rem only costs 3 to cast, so we should be able to cast him a couple of times in a game. But just in case, the deck's also running Personal Sanctuary, Light of Sanction, and Runetail Kitsune Ascendant. The former protects us from taking damage during our own turn. So if we're casting those global damage spells during our turn, we should be fine. Light of Sanction and Runetail, when it flips into its essence, do the same but for our creatures. The best thing about Runetail is that we start off with 40 life, so it's very likely that it's going to almost always flip into its essence the moment it hits the battlefield. Besides protecting ourselves and our creatures to double down further on Rem's effects, we can also do the same for its damage increasing effect, especially since the goal of the deck is to burn away the competition as quickly as possible. Torbrand, Thane of Redfell, and Embermaw Hellion both increase the damage from our red sources. Since all the deck's burn spells are red, these are a no-brainer. However, even better than that, most of the creatures in the deck are also red, so they increase their damage as well, including Rem's. So you could also potentially kill off an opponent with commander damage, especially with Gisela Brilliant of Gold Knight, Fiendish Duo, and to a certain extent Fire Servant, since it'll only double damage from red instants and sorceries we control. While the first two double all damage that opponents take from any sources, Fire Servant only doubles it from red instants and sorceries we control. While that might seem incredibly niche, keep in mind that it helps casting burn spells earlier and for not such a deep investment in mana. You're also adding more doubling effects which then multiply onto each other exponentially. As a bonus, Gisela also protects us and our permanents, albeit by having the damage instead of preventing it altogether, but she's still an amazing card here. Dictate of the Twin Gods, Furnace of Wrath, and Fiery Emancipation also multiply damage, with the latter tripling it. These are harder to get rid of since they're enchantments. The first two also affect us, so keep that in mind when getting attacked by creatures. But at least Rem protects us from damage from spells, so at least we can still have them on the battlefield and take 0 damage from our global burn spells, while opponents take it all and then some. For a quick math lesson direct from Magical Christmas Land, assuming you have all these cards, casting a Rolling Earthquake for something as low as x equals 1 is going to deal 480 damage to all creatures and players except to us and our creatures, although Rem's going to take 240 damage from it. That's 480 damage from just one initial damage. Granted, this is an exaggeration, but it serves to show how much can be dealt from fewer of these effects in play with a humble amount of initial damage from our burn spells. Pyromancer's Goggles is also included not only as an incidental mana rock, but as yet another multiplicative effect. If we use that red mana to cast a red spell, it's going to get copied. So not only will this work with any other red spell on the deck, but if used when casting a massive burn spell, it's going to be copied. So it can also help in that regard to really burn away the competition. Toralf, Galls of Fury, and Repercussion make it so that burn spells that only hit creatures still end up hitting opponents. So if you have Toralf out and resolve something like Star of Extinction, chances are that you just end the game. This is why Toralf will almost always be at the side cast and not Toralf's Hammer. It might depend on some very fringe cases, but at least the hammer can return to your hand so you can then cast Toralf afterwards. But this card will almost solely be cast as Toralf because of the synergy with the deck. As for Repercussion, be careful when you cast a burn spell. It's Repercussion that's going to be hitting us, not the burn spell. So Rem won't protect us there. If anyone snipes Rem in response, we can lose along with everyone else. Keep in mind that Rem prevents the damage done to our creatures, so Repercussion is going to deal us 0 damage from that 0 damage dealt to our other creatures. So we'll only take damage from whatever Rem takes. Radiant Scroll Wielder and Firesong and Sunspeaker can help in that regard since these creatures help us gain a ridiculous amount of life. If we're casting a burn spell that's hitting all of our opponent's creatures along with them, we're going to gain a lot of life. So even if we can't prevent the damage dealt to us later on because Rem is gone and we don't have Personal Sanctuary, it's not going to matter because having more life means surviving any kamikaze burn spell. As a bonus, the Scroll Wielder also lets us reuse an instant or sorcery spell at random from our graveyard, which is an amazing bonus. Getting that effortless flashback is worth it even if it's at random. Neheb the Eternal makes it so that our burn spells multiply our mana as well. If we don't have enough mana to sink into a finishing burn spell, we can at least spend what we can on one, deal a ton of damage with it, and then potentially get triple that mana back in red. That should then be enough to follow up with a game-ending burn spell. Besides that, Neheb is great on its own since it's not just limited to burn spells. If we attack into an empty board, since we're also blasting away creatures, he'll also give us mana for that damage. Just make sure to do all your burn damage before combat so that it's all added together for post-combat main phase. The following cards in the deck are the essential card advantage, responses, and mana acceleration of any deck. The deck isn't entirely dependent on Rem since there are a couple of cards peppered in for redundancy, but he needs protection given that he doesn't protect himself. How very red-white, right? Lightning Greaves, Swiftfoot Boots, and Champion's Helm are here to protect him from spot removal more so than getting burned from our own effects. Remember that if anyone removes Rem in response to any of our mass burn spells, then we'll suffer that damage along with everyone else and our creatures too, potentially taking ourselves out of the match. So giving him Shroud and or Hexproof takes priority. Burrow's Charm, Flawless Maneuver, and Teferi's Protection give us a chance to protect all of our creatures in case it does happen. Granted, these are only one time, but we only need to survive long enough to kill off everyone that same turn. At least Teferi protects us from our own burn spell by phasing us out entirely. Wandering Archaic, one of my favorite cards in a long time, can somewhat protect us from control players by making their counter spells cost 2 mana more. On top of that, any beneficial spell whose tax wasn't paid, we get to copy. So any ramp spell, tutor, etc. we can also benefit from. If any opponent plays any burn spell of their own and doesn't pay the tax, that's just the cherry on top since our copy resolves first and we won't take any damage from it thanks to Rem. Explore the Vast Lands is somewhat useful since it can help us dig for a land if we need it or an instant or sorcery spell, which can be any burn spell we don't currently have. However, it also benefits opponents, so more often than not, this should be cast as Wandering Archaic instead. As for our own removal, you can't go wrong with Generous Gift, Chaos Warp, and Wear and Tear. These are pretty ubiquitous and for good reason. They can deal with pretty much anything in our way to victory, so don't use them haphazardly, just them against any permanent that prevents damage, etc. An Overloaded Vandal Blast takes care of all artifacts, so while it's mostly used to nerf mana rocks, it can also be used to destroy any stacks effects on artifacts since we want to be able to do our explosive turns to burn away the table in one fell swoop. But doing it over a couple of turns is okay too. Shatter Skull Smashing can only hit creatures and only up to 2 of that, but with our damage increasing effects we don't need to sink so much mana into it. However, while it synergizes amazingly well with the deck, the fact remains that it's included because it doesn't take up a slot in the deck because its backside is a mana generating land with the potential of entering the battlefield untapped. So while it can get rid of up to 2 creatures in a pinch, this card is mostly a land than a burn spell, but it can still be a burn spell in a pinch if need be. Blood Moon is incredibly oppressive here. The deck's running enough basic planes where it is in a hindrance to us, but incredibly abusive against multicolored decks without many basics. Red-White has a hard time as it is keeping up in Commander games, so we have to do all we can to slow others down to have a fighting chance. Faithless Looting, Thrill of Possibility, Tormenting Voice, Wild Guess, and Cathartic Reunion are included to get some much needed draw. We do need to burn through our library, no pun intended, in order to get our win con set up. It also helps to dig through responses if we should need them. That being said, you can't go wrong with Wheel of Misfortune and Reforge the Soul. Thanks to Rem, you can literally choose the largest number you could ever think of with Wheel of Misfortune, and you won't take any damage from it. But if any opponent needs to wheel, they're going to have to bite quite the bullet, especially if we have damage doublers and or increasers on the battlefield. Even a modestly low number might end up still dealing quite a lot of damage. If they don't want to risk it and choose 0, then we're going to be the only one wielding all for 0 damage. As for the number chosen, you can't go wrong with a Googleplex. It's easy to say and it's an insanely huge number, respectively, since largest in numbers is relative. Mangara the Diplomat, Esper Sentinel, and Mind's Eye further help us draw cards, albeit depending on our opponent's actions, as tends to be the case for white color identity draw. Having a couple of stacks effects in this deck definitely goes a long way, and these aren't the only ones you're going to see, as well as the previously mentioned ones like Blood Moon, but we'll see the rest in a bit. War Room and Reliquary Tower are some card advantage pieces that don't take up a slot in the deck. While War Room might seem a bit overcosted, it's still helpful if we have the mana but nothing to do with it. The tower doesn't directly help with card draw, but it helps us keep a fat hand just in case. As for Mana Acceleration, Sword of the Animus, Sword of Hearth and Home, and Burnished Heart included explains why there's 18 basic lands in the deck. Fortunately, our commander is a hasty flyer, so the swords are amazing here and can really help us out in the early game. The Elk is just another colorless way to get lands directly onto the battlefield, which is very limited for red-white decks. At least the swords also further pump Rem for the potential commander knockout when the damage is magnified and multiplied. Land tax also helps us in the basic land department, but they go to our hand instead of the battlefield. That's fine because it helps us guarantee our land drops, and Terrain Generator can help us get an extra one on the battlefield at a cost. At least until we catch up to the ramping green player. Then land tax just stays there doing nothing until someone else gets ahead again. Some more auto-included cards are Smothering Tithe and Monologue Tax, not just because they're essentially mono-white mana acceleration, but because this deck wants to generate as much mana as possible, at least when it comes to fueling potentially game-ending X damage burn spells. Having players pay or not pay their taxes is still win-win for us, since we either get ahead or they slow down. So hopefully white keeps getting goodies that are also consistently reprinted in future sets and products. Soul Ring, Mana Crypt, Mana Vault, Arcane Signet, Boros Signet, Talisman of Conviction, and Fulwar Stone, the actual mana rocks in the deck, need no further explanation other than the deck isn't green. That being said, with so many ways of getting basics on the battlefield, we don't have to be green with envy. This time the pun is intended. Urza's Saga also helps out a bit since it doesn't take up a slot in the deck and can eventually be used to get either Soul Ring, Mana Crypt, or Mana Vault onto the battlefield. However, keep in mind that it can also be used to get Esper Sentinel on the battlefield since it's still a 1-drop artifact, so getting it early on is very helpful either way. The rest of the deck is just the rest of the lands. The deck's running Plateau, Sacred Foundry, Spectator Seating, Clifftop Retreat, Rugged Prairie, Battlefield Forge, Reflecting Pool, Command Tower, City of Brass, Mana Confluence, and Ancient Tomb, as well as 9 of each basic land. The deck's running a ton of basic lands because of how many ramp effects it's able to run. If we're able to get those engines going, hopefully we can pace or even outmatch green decks. As with all of my deck techs, you don't have to run the more expensive mana sources like Plateau, Mana Vault, and Mana Crypt if you don't already have them, won't proxy them, or aren't playing online. You can very easily swap them out for budget substitutes and the deck will still work just fine, especially since almost the entirety of the cost of this deck is in those 3 cards. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Rem Karolus Stalwart Slayer. I've been wanting to build a Fire Song and Sunspeaker deck for the longest time, but haven't really perfected it. It wasn't as ironed out as I wanted it to be, it would always be too clunky. I especially wanted to build them since it was a nice change of pace from all of the combat-centered red-white legendary creatures. However, now with Rem Karolus, there's an even better commander for that shell I was trying to make work with the Minotaurs, and thus this deck is what you see here for the season finale. If you're interested in the deck list of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the Brewers, for their patronage. I'd also like to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link, that also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am the Benedict Kirby, and happy brewing.